Welcome to Mediatwits number 180. I'm Mark Glazer, executive editor and publisher of Media Shift. Today we'll be talking about the attacks on Paris and how they're covered around the globe. The way that spread online on Twitter, the misinformation that spread, and also the fact-checking that happened around the world as the world paid attention and covered the terrorist attacks in Paris. Before we get into the discussion, a word from our sponsor. It takes a village to raise a child and also to grow a business. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace lets you do both with a co-working community and early childhood care and education program under one roof. With NextSpace and NextKids, you can focus on your business and your family without compromise. Visit nextspace.us/nextkids to learn more. Before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel this week. We have Andrew Lee joining us from American University, Joshua Keating at Slate in DC, Lindsay Palmer at the University of Wisconsin. So it was interesting to see once again when the news broke about the attacks on Paris, just the way that things kind of played out on social media the way it typically does. On Twitter was obviously a place to kind of follow how things were going. Joshua, what do you think stood out this time, the way that coverage kind of how things unfolded online?
Well, it's a little different from some of the other cases we've been talking about. I think, that there was so much attention in the U.S. media. I can't really speak to how the coverage was in France on this bombing, but there was kind of a lot of American readers and American journalists don't know Paris or this area that well, so there was also kind of a lack of context. I didn't pick up on that many major errors that were circulating in the early coverage, at least none that were picked up on by major outlets. The one exception was there were reports, I think, that Reuters had that there was another shooting going on at the Les Halles market, and there were some rumors floating around of attacks near the Louvre or the Pompidou Center. I think what it turned out was this was just added security because of the attacks happening elsewhere in the city. But that, I think, was the major misinformation I saw. I think compared to some other incidents, people were perhaps a little more cautious this time.
Yeah, you think that there are definitely lessons learned from, let's say, the Boston bombings and even the last attacks in Paris?
I think that just because people, a lot of readers lacked context for what was happening in France, at least in the U.S., I can't speak to what happened in France. There was a little less of the kind of amateur sleuthing we saw after Boston or even the attempted Times Square bombing a few years ago.
Lindsay, you wrote a little bit about kind of the way that the media, at least the Western media, in covering these things can get a little bit too patriotic in the way that they cover things and kind of standing with with France and the French people and the French government. How do you think this kind of played out versus previous terrorist attacks when it comes to the way the kind of patriotic coverage that's happened in the past from the U.S.?
Well, in the past from the U.S., a lot of times what we've seen is just your very classic definition of patriotic coverage, which, when you think of the term patriotism, you often think about an attitude toward one's own nation. But in my discussion, I've really been drawing a lot upon some of the work of global media ethicists who think about the ways in which patriotism can actually become more global in scope. And in the case of the Paris attacks, unfortunately, in U.S. news coverage, what we've seen is a lot of this sort of very quick and actually sort of decontextualized and highly emotional solidarity coverage and solidarity statements that unfortunately sometimes submerge the larger historical context behind these things.
And does that kind of lead to, in a way, when the media kind of jumps on it in that patriotic way, does it sometimes lead to kind of what we've seen with Islamophobia and kind of, just lumping people in when it comes to blame?
I think so. I mean, there are some things that this coverage has in common, even with some of the coverage as long ago as just right on the day of 9/11, right, where there's this very emotional reaction, and understandably so, because this is a horrible event, and many, many people have been highly traumatized by what's happened. But the problem with that is that when journalists and their larger institutions don't continue to kind of demand balance, and also this repeated return to the history of colonialism in the region, to the history of xenophobic treatment of Muslim populations in Europe and in the United States, then yes, all too quickly we see this return again to this very shorthand Islamophobia. I think the difference this time has been some of the digital responses, the hashtag, for example, not in my name, Muslims are not terrorists, the people online who've kind of moved to speak back and say you can't conflate these specific terrorists with all of us. It's just simply not that simple.
So you thought it actually was a little bit better, that the reactions online weren't quite as bad as they'd been in the past?
Well, I don't know if I would say better, but I would definitely say that at least there's been the visibility of some different perspectives. And I wouldn't say I've seen this in mainstream, especially corporate U.S. news coverage, but I've seen it in online, just in the sort of social media world. Speaking
of that, Andrew, what did you think about the way that news organizations are kind of mixing having someone on the ground at the spot, the typical kind of classical reporting, versus how they're collecting things online on social media, trying to fact check things the way that something like Reportedly does? Do you think they're getting better at it now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're seeing that firms that specifically specialize in verifying social media accounts and trying to triangulate on reliable eyewitness accounts, so folks like Storyful and other agencies like that are really necessary in these types of environments, right? So that's something that we're quite mature in doing now, because it's now accepted as a mode of reporting, is gathering the kind of social media footprint of people on the ground or people who can get photos and videos of things that are happening out there. So I think this was really not the case in the early days of Twitter, but now we actually have a pretty mature way of sifting those things.
Yeah, and do you think that that there's kind of, in some cases, there's almost a danger of relying too much on social media sometimes?
Well, I think we're not too bad. I mean, it's one thing if it happens in Paris and other places where there's good network connections, there's a pretty well understood environment. It's another thing if it happens in in developing countries and places where we're really not sure about the environment and there's unreliable network connections. So I think in this case I didn't see that much of it. I mean, I did a lot of work with trying to oversee the Wikipedia article on this, and Wikipedia tends not to look too much into social media. It tries to wait for mainstream organizations to embrace the social media reporting. So I wasn't on top of all the social media, but I thought it was not as out of control as I remember seeing other types of breaking events in the past, because we have better filters for these things, we have better experience with them.
Yeah, do you think there's something that other media outlets can learn from the way Wikipedia operates when it comes to breaking news?
I think so. I mean, one of the nice things about having, we're entering into the 15th year of Wikipedia now, is that there's actually a fairly well-established set of guidelines and practices for reporting on current events, whether they're natural disasters or terrorist attacks. And, a lot of it is kind of this, don't shoot till you see the white of their eyes type of approach, saying don't write something in Wikipedia until you have 2-3 verifiable reports from reliable sources. And that was really heartening to see, is that culture of verifiability in Wikipedia. Unfortunately, that we've had enough terrorist incidents that this is a well understood phenomenon in Wikipedia of trying to get the facts down while trying to support tons of people reading that article and knowing that a lot of anonymous folks will come by trying to do the right thing by saying, oh, I just saw on CNN it's 165 people died, and then we have to kind of say, well, slow down, where is that coming from? Is it someone speaking it? Is it down on a website somewhere? And how many people have said that statistic? So I think there are things that news organizations can learn, and I think people will be quite astonished to see that Wikipedia actually does have very thoughtful discourse about what makes it into an article and what doesn't, and how you verify information.
And Joshua, how do you, when something like this happens, how are you typically kind of following what's going on? Because you're putting together these roundups that are really comprehensive. What are you looking at? How are you following things as they unfold in a place like Paris?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a combination of looking at social media, refreshing the reports that are coming out from the ground, and a lot of communication with my coworkers as well. We have a fairly large team following these events at Slate. We're sharing things with each other. I will say that I think I'm a little less concerned about the kind of immediate factual mistakes made in the coverage of what's going on during the attack than some of the misinformation that spreads as we move from the attack ourselves to the political response to it. Now is when you start to see kind of dubious or misleading stories being pushed that are actually serving a political agenda rather than are just the result of confusion or the fog of war. I mean, I wrote about one today. There was a Breitbart story early this week that was picked up on Drudge. The Trump campaign has run with it about 8 Syrians being supposedly detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. 2 days later, the DHS came out and explained that these people hadn't been caught; they had presented themselves at the border. This was like if this was a secret ISIS plot, they're really playing a long game. So, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I think is really more concerning to me than whether it's a few old pictures are recirculated immediately as the event is going on.
Yeah, and the same thing is true about kind of the migrant part. There's this whole kind of fear that one of them was a migrant or posing as a migrant, and that's kind of had a whole backlash as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing how quickly in the U.S. the conversation has sort of framed itself around the migrant issue. It reminds me a little bit about how after the shooting in Charleston, rather than having a national conversation about guns, it very quickly became one about the Confederate flag. This time it's turned out what we're talking about is not the very complicated and tricky question that nobody has a good answer for on what to do about ISIS, but something that maybe we feel like we have a little more control over, which is this, in the scheme of things, very small number of refugees who want to come to the U.S. So that's what the American political conversation has turned into in reaction to this, and I think that the media has largely followed the lead of that, and a lot of the coverage now, while it seems like a bit of a non sequitur, is focusing not on what's happening in France or even what's happening in Syria, but on these refugees who want to move to the U.S.
Yeah, Lindsay, do you want to jump in on that one too? What you're seeing as far as like how we kind of jump from one thing to the next and take blame and just kind of change the subject?
Yeah, I think that it's unfortunately a common problem in these situations, and I completely agree with Josh that we've seen, just these statements by different governors of the United States saying that they're no longer interested in letting the paltry amount of refugees into their states, right? I mean, the U.S. has been one of the sort of last nations to really take in, very many refugees from Syria at all. And so this jump from these kinds of hysterical moments into policy that makes the move of actually conflating, extremists and terrorists with the entire group of people trying to find a better life, that kind of thing is just the sloppy maneuver that media and the journalists more generally need to be working against.
Yeah, because it seems like once you kind of go down that path, it's hard to go back and start thinking about these more complicated topics. I mean, I have seen some great coverage about, ISIS and where it came from and what it's all about, and it seems like at least there's some more digging going into, the funding behind it and so many other aspects of it, but that doesn't seem like it's always the case.
Yeah, and I think that the huge amount of energy going into the investigation of ISIS is also just part of the fact that ISIS, as many foreign journalists have told me in the process of doing my research, ISIS is now the sort of hot button term in journalism, especially in war reporting. And there are a lot of good reasons for that, and I think it is actually helping us to produce some really important information, for sure. But at the same time, we've got to be thinking about the way that information gets connected to real political change or to forays back into a past we may not want to revisit.
And Jefferson's bringing up this note about how the global empathy gap between Paris and Beirut, because there were obviously attacks in Beirut. There was the down Russian airliner as well that ISIS might have been involved in. So Andrew, do you notice that too? It's like, you're basically picking and choosing when it comes to what you want to look at, and there's a different kind of empathy when it comes to Lebanon or a Russian jet than it is Paris.
Right, and Facebook became the center of that, right? So the Facebook safety check was something that existed even before this, but I think for most people this was the first real experience with it, because a lot of folks know someone probably related to Paris or France and saw the little message pop up on their mobile phone saying that Christophe is safe, and you're like, wow, that's a really cool feature. But for better or for worse, Facebook doesn't turn it on all the time, and they got some flack for saying they've kind of cherry-picked certain things that they believe rises to a crisis and other things are not. So that was kind of interesting to see that debate happen.
Yeah, when did Facebook did this safety check? Is this just something they've recently done?
I think Zuckerberg came out and said basically that the design of it was originally for natural disasters, and I guess that's a pretty reasonable defense of the position that Facebook had, saying we didn't turn it on for every single crisis because it was geared towards natural disaster, but they have turned it on selectively in the past. And the big question is, can you have safety check as a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week thing that's persistently there? It makes sense for things that are kind of, something happens and you have a need to find out if someone's safe. But then what about long-term safety, right? That's not something you could really express in a binary way. So that is something that Facebook and other folks who have this feature trying to struggle with.
Yeah, because you don't always know, and if they make a mistake, I mean, there could be problems of identification, or they don't get the right person, and it could backfire in a way.
Right. So, or what if you're a refugee and you're not immediately, in danger, but you have no house, you've got no money? It's a very tough thing to try to encapsulate into a Facebook icon or some kind of Facebook setting.
Josh, did you notice anything as far as Twitter? They started these moments where they're trying to kind of capture everything that's happening. Did you follow what they did this time? Did you think they reacted in a good way to it?
I didn't actually. I'll be honest with you. I've never really used Moments since they introduced it, and I wasn't really checking. I was kind of following it the old-fashioned way on Twitter, just sort of following my regular feed. I believe this Beirut versus Paris question has gotten a lot of attention, and if I could speak up in defense of the profession a little bit, I mean, I think a lot of times now when people say that the media as an entity ignored a certain story, they're actually talking about social media now, and the reaction to the story as much as the reporting. I mean, obviously there was far less reporting on Beirut than there was in Paris, but every major news outlet had a story on it, had reporters on the ground. Slate had one post on it. We had about 40 on Paris, I'll admit. But some of this is people afterward, or readers afterwards say, why don't you guys cover Beirut? And the sad point is a lot of the stories on Beirut often don't get as much reaction, which is why they don't get as much coverage. And I'm cribbing a little bit from something Max Fisher wrote on Vox earlier this week, but I think that if people want more attention focused on non-European, non-American disasters, that's going to be a little bit on them as well.
In other words, you're basically just reacting to what people are checking out on your site. It's hard for you to justify covering something when you're not getting the attention that it.
Yeah, I haven't checked the traffic numbers, but I'm guessing my post on Beirut didn't get nearly the number of readers as one short item covering one small aspect of the Paris attacks, which is not a state of affairs I'm defending, but I think that we should think a little bit about what we mean by the media as well. I guess it's hosting the show, but the media is often we're talking more about the commentary rather than the actual on the ground reporting.
Do you think this might be, Lindsay, do you think this might be a role for more nonprofit media where maybe they're not going to worry quite kind of as much when it comes to reach and page views and all that they would take a more of a concern in places that are undercovered?
Well, I definitely think that's the case, that nonprofit media and even, what could even be sort of termed activist or advocacy media have already been doing a lot of interesting work trying to sort of respond to what they see as the blanks in coverage. But I think Josh's point is well taken. I also agree we need to sort of parse out the term, the media. It is a very monolithic term. And it does seem as though, of course, mainly we've been talking about North American and European media to some extent, and even perhaps this conversation's been geared more toward Anglophone media. With the Beirut attacks on the very same day as the Paris attacks, of course, Al Jazeera English was covering Beirut. Plenty of other, even English language news outlets that are based outside these sort of U.S. and Western European contexts were very interested in this question. So first of all, there's sort of the matter of like which national media context are we talking about? Even though we are in a sort of globalized world, that sort of thing still matters. And then second of all, are we talking about scale here? Because if only 1 or 2 stories have been done about Beirut and then 40 have been done about Paris, it does make it a little bit more difficult for the average reader or viewer, to notice that, right? So maybe that's part of the thing that could impact, in a sense, the reason why social media is kind of chattering about this not being covered. There are just a lot of different things in play, and I really like the point that we need to think about what we mean by that term, because it means so many different things.
Yeah, the ecosystem in general, it's really changed so much. And when, someone on the ground posting something on Facebook or Twitter could be considered part of the media in a way, just because so many people are creating it now. Well, thanks a lot for the discussion. It was really good. I want to thank our panel, Andrew Lee at American University, our producer Jefferson Yen in LA, Joshua Keating at Slate, Lindsay Palmer at University of Wisconsin. And you can catch us each and every week on the Mediatwits. Our podcast is at mediashift.org. You can follow us on Twitter at the Mediatwits. Our past episodes are on SoundCloud and YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes and leave us a review. I want to thank our sponsors, Next Space and Next Kids. We'll catch you all next week.